Hello, everyone. We're going to wait a few more minutes for everyone to arrive before we begin. So hello and welcome. My name is Aisha Jamal. I'm Canadian film programmer at Hot Docs, and it's my pleasure to be hosting today's discussion of Kevin McMahon's documentary Borealis. I want to thank the National Film Board of Canada and Hot Docs at Home for organizing today's event. And if you're joining us and you haven't had a chance to see the film yet, don't worry, you'll still be able to see the film after our discussion today. You can see the film for free within Canada by going to nfb.ca, or if you'd like to see it in French, you can go to onf.ca. Now, I'd like to begin today by asking our panelists to introduce themselves. So let's start with the director of the film. Joining us from Toronto is Kevin McMahon. Kevin, over to you.
Hello. I'm Kevin McMahon. I'm the director of the film.
Great. And all the way from Nelson, BC, we have Dr. Suzanne Simard. If you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Suzanne Simard. I'm a professor of forest ecology at the University of British Columbia. I've been working with my colleagues at University of Alberta on plant connection and communication in the mountain pine beetle influences on these for the last number of years, and which has got relevance to the film that I hope we can talk about as we go along here.
Great, thank you, Suzanne. And joining us from Edmonton, Alberta is Dr. Mike Flannigan. Mike?
Hello, everyone. I'm a professor of wildland fire at the University of Alberta. I'm also the scientific director of Canada Wildfire. Simply put, I'm a fire guy and a weather guy. Thanks.
Great, so welcome, everybody. You know, in the film, we hear a lot of people talk about their relationship to this very special ecosystem. And I wanted to start by asking each one of you about your relationship to the boreal forest. So maybe we could start with you, Suzanne.
Yeah, so I actually live in a temperate forest, which is south of the boreal in British Columbia, but I've done quite a bit of research in the boreal forest and the subboreal forest. I have a project called the Mother Tree Project that extends into the subboreal in British Columbia. And then, as I mentioned, I've been doing quite a bit of work with graduate students and professors at U of A in the boreal itself. But I don't actually live in the boreal forest. I love it, but I live in a temperate forest.
And Mike?
I grew up in Thunder Bay, Ontario, in a boreal forest, and skiing, the quiet, the peaceful nature of the boreal forest. It was just delightful, a treasure, and I greatly appreciate it. I'm in Edmonton now, which is close to the boreal, but we're not in the boreal anymore. Thanks.
Does your work touch on the boreal forest as well?
Oh, yeah. I look at fires, primarily the boreal. I also look at fires in Russia and globally as well. So my primary focus is fires in Canada, and over half of Canada is boreal forest.
Wow. And Kevin, what about you?
Well, like Suzanne, I live in a temperate forest because I'm in Toronto. Although I have a little cabin in about 2 hours north of here, which is just where the Great Lakes mixed forest begins to meet the boreal. But most of my experience in the Boreal has been making films, because most of my work is doing environmental films. So I've done lots of shooting in northern parts of Canada. I actually came up with the idea for this film when I was on the Nahanni River, which is in the Northwest Territories. So I've had the good fortune of being able to travel in the forest quite a bit. And of course, in the course of making the film, I was in it for about a year, which was just a delight.
Oh, great. So I want to remind our audience that if you have a question for any of our panelists or all three panelists, you can put it in the chat box of this YouTube live website. And we have a question already for Kevin. And Kevin, this is an unusual documentary. Can you talk about some of the creative and visual approaches you used? What about the sound design and edit in your film?
Sure. The film is unusual in the sense that the idea of the film was to try and show the forest from the perspective of the trees, in order to give us a different view of the way we look at forests. You know, the idea that I wanted to communicate, one of the ideas was that the forest is a community, and that that these beings have they have a relationship as a community and to their environment and whatever. But they presumably, we don't know how trees see the world, but we can imagine how they see the world. And I think to them, maybe we're like a mosquito would be to us, like little things flitting about. So I tried to represent that in the film, and I felt that in order to make the film about the forest, it was important to really focus on the forest. So that's why there are no talking head speakers in the film. We see people as they interact with the forest, because as time goes on and they have an impact on the forest. But I wanted to keep the focus on the trees and the plant community and the animals that live in the forest itself. So that's why the film was designed the way it was. I don't know if that answers the question, but
no, yeah, it does, definitely. Mike, I have a question for you. Why did you choose to participate in the making of this film?
So I do a lot of media because I think it's really important for the public to be informed, because then as a society, we can make informed decisions. And it was about the Boreal. I mean, it's what I study. So I'm always willing to talk to someone, especially with a reputation like Kevin has. I knew it was going to be a quality production. I just rewatched it today. The cinematography is great, and the audio quality is great. It makes my voice sound half decent. So they obviously do a really great job, and they did.
Yeah. I do want to mention that we've hit over 100 viewers that are joining us today right now. So
Wonderful.
Please, I'll remind you to make sure to enter your questions so we can get everybody on the panel to answer the burning questions you might have. Suzanne, I wanted to ask you, you're an expert on forests. So what's your take on the film?
It's unique in the way that Kevin shot this from the perspective of the trees and the creatures that live in the forest. And I found that so refreshing. And, we usually don't view forests from that perspective. And I think that's extremely valuable. I think, one of the things I'm trying to communicate with my own research is that, how to treat forests with respect, and how to conserve forests for all the wonderful qualities that they provide and the life support systems that they provide us, that they're essential to the air we breathe, the water that we drink, and so on. And I think that part of the reason that forests are suffering so much is that we never really put ourselves in their shoes, or in their roots, I should say. And I think if we can relate to them, as equals to us, or, as important as us. And they are. I know most people don't think that way, and that's a social thing, right? It's a societal thing, but we need to flip this around. And I think that this film helps a lot in doing that. It's one major step forward in helping people to see the world from a tree's perspective and the lynx perspective and so on. It's absolutely crucial.
Mm-hmm. That makes the film very special. Kevin, I have another question for you. How does the final film and the way it's been released measure up to your initial vision? Is there anything you would change now?
Well, what I would change now is that the film came out in a year when there wasn't a pandemic, so that we could have shown it in theaters and had these conversations with people in theaters and in the lobbies, and all that great stuff that we're able to do when we can actually take our documentaries into the community. The film itself, I'm happy with. I haven't had the experience of watching it with an audience because it hasn't been possible. Sometimes when you do that, you see what works and what doesn't, and then maybe I would think, oh, I would have, tried to put in more jokes. But by and large, I'm pleased with the film. It worked out pretty well.
Mike, the movie talks about it's long been thought that the boreal forest absorbs carbon, but it's now thought that it's an emitter. Can you speak to that?
Sure. So we'll go back to Kyoto. Canada argued vociferously to include an article that gave you credit for a forest. Then the government did analysis and found out would be more likely to be a carbon source than a sink. That means carbon going into the atmosphere instead of the plants and the trees sucking up the carbon. And the reason for this is disturbance. And that estimate was correct. Most years, our forests now are a carbon source because of fires, insects, disease. Mountain pine beetle killed a lot of trees. They decompose, releases carbon to the atmosphere. So we are contributing to greenhouse warming again because of these disturbances. The boreal forest is governed by disturbances. It's the cycle of life. I mean, we see that in the film. You have a fire, new generation of plants come up, and then another fire comes and we start the cycle again.
I wanted to ask you a little bit more about that as well, Suzanne. There's a lot of discussion these days about trees talking to one another. How has your research proven that communication? And what do we know about the content of that communication?
Well, one of the things that I've worked on for years is how trees are connected below ground by a suite of fungi called mycorrhizal fungi. And they're an obligate mutualist of trees. That means that all the trees all over the world depend on mycorrhizas, which are a kind of fungus that associate with trees and plants. And the job of the fungus is to grow through the soil, this huge hyphal network, and gather up nutrients and water and bring them back to the trees and plants. And in exchange, the trees provide photosynthate because the fungi themselves don't have leaves, and so they can't photosynthesize. So they both give something to each other that they need. And these fungal networks can actually link plants and trees together. And in the boreal forest, the jack pine, the spruce, the aspen, the poplars all share fungi in common, species of fungi in common. And there are thousands and thousands of species in the boreal forest of fungi, mycorrhizal fungi, but they share many in common. And so they link the trees together in this big, enormous network. And what I've researched over the years is how these networks, they kind of serve like the internet, where communication goes on via these mycorrhizal networks. And that communication takes the form of many, many ways, but one of them is that these trees and plants will transmit resources back and forth between them. And you can think of it like, we also transmit between us as humans in our communities through language. And so, the movement of resources, water, nitrogen, phosphorus, and so on, is a kind of a language of how trees communicate. And there's many other bits of information that they pass back and forth. For example, they send defense signals. For example, they can send recognition signals, like they can recognize whether they're related or not. And that's just one avenue of communication. The other avenue is above ground. So trees and plants will also communicate through what we call volatile organic compounds that transmit through the air. And they can signal all kinds of things like pollination, flowering, but also this idea that of defense, that if there are different plants that are being affected by like the mountain pine beetle, for example. They'll emit volatile organic compounds and transmit information to their neighbors. And so this is another form of a communication. And so just like in humans, when we have multiple modes of communication, so do trees and plants.
I have an audience question for Kevin. Amazing things captured. What was the shot you were most excited about getting? Was there something you really wanted that you didn't get?
I don't think there was anything that I really wanted that we didn't get. I think the shots, the sequence that I was most excited to get, although it's a tragic sequence, is toward the end of the film where cinematographer Joshua C., working with people from the University of Alberta with a professor called Stan Booten, recorded this amazing scene where the pine cones up in Kluane all opened and released all these seeds prematurely because of warming, thereby depriving the red squirrel population there of their winter food. And I know from my cabin what red squirrels are like and what a profound tragedy it is for them, because they spend the whole autumn caching and they would have gone hungry last winter. So, but to actually be able to be on site and witness a climate change phenomena in real time is really extraordinary, because I mean, I've been working on climate change for 20 years. We've made all kinds of films about it, but it's very hard to represent. One of the reasons there's so much argument about it is because people don't actually see it happening in front of their eyes. So for me, that was extraordinary, tragic, but extraordinary as a documentary to be able to capture that.
We have another audience comment. This was such a powerful documentary. It makes me want to take action. Are there any organizations you would recommend for people interested in getting involved with boreal conservation? And I can see Mike thinking. Mike, would you be ready to answer that, or should I give it over to Suzanne first?
Try Suzanne first. Sorry, Suzanne.
Well, because I don't live in the boreal forest, I just know about, like, there's many environmental organizations that are at the forefront of conservation, and they're organized, they're strategic, they're knowledgeable, they work with scientists, highly effective, and so I would go to those first. So Greenpeace, Sierra Club, Western Canada's Wilderness Committee, Ancient Forest Alliance, there's many of them. And yeah, there might be some that are specific to the boreal that perhaps Mike knows about, or Kevin, but that would be my first thing. That's what I would do, is I would go to those organized INGOs first and foremost, because they have strategic visions.
Okay, great. Mike, did you want to add anything to that list?
I'm having a senior moment, and sorry, I can't add anything to that.
That's okay. We can come back to it if you think of something. Kevin, anything you want to add?
Well, I think I agree exactly with what Suzanne said. I mean, I think it would depend partly on where you live, because there are groups across the country, like around here, Wildlands League is quite effective. And out in British Columbia, I don't know. I mean, I don't work with these groups. I mean, David Suzuki's organization certainly focuses on the boreal forest quite a bit. So I think it's not hard to do a tiny bit of research online and find more groups than you will be able to give money to.
Great.
One other came to mind, which is Y2Y, Yellowstone to the Yukon, is another really good organization. Yeah.
Great. Thank you for mentioning that one. We have a related, it's kind of a comment, but also a question from a viewer who says, I'm a single guy who lives in a one-bed apartment, or one-bedroom apartment, I assume he's saying. I don't drive and recycle the best I can. What else can I do? I've already got a tiny footprint. Mike, any advice here?
Well, you're doing great if you have a tiny footprint, but you can encourage others and you can vote, okay, for those parties that are going to reduce greenhouse gases, as well as talk to people, communicate, share your vision that we have to reduce emissions to get ahead of climate change. we're not going to solve this as individuals. We have to work with our cities, our municipalities, our provinces, our federal government, as well as globally. And the global community, now with the United States back on board, I think we can make some real headway.
Mm-hmm. Suzanne, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think Mike hit it right on. And I think too, governments don't always follow through on what their election promises are. And I think we need to hold their feet to the fire. I think that's true federally as well as provincially and globally as well. And so, keep on top of what they're doing, like keep your awareness up and write to your MLAs and your MPs when you feel like they're falling down, and they do all the time.
Great. Kevin, anything to add?
I wholeheartedly agree with both of those comments. Every time I show an environmental film, this question comes up, and I agree with Mike. We are very limited in what we can do as individuals, and I think it's at the least unfair for it to be put on us as individuals. We live inside giant systems, enormous machines, and those machines need to be retooled. And can be, I feel very confident that they can be retooled, but it's going to take a lot of work and a lot of sacrifices. And I agree with Suzanne, it has to be communicated to politicians, because, what we've seen in the pandemic has been very instructive. A lot of politicians are afraid to ask their constituents to do anything, and certainly afraid to ask them to make really the hard sacrifices. And some aren't, and when we see, looking around the world, that places where people took on, really the sacrifices, they've done better. So yeah, I think it really comes down to politics more than anything.
So I have a longer note from an audience member. I recently discovered that all earthworm species in Ontario are invasive species and a threat to soil systems due to their decomposing nature. This rids the protective leaf layer in forests for native plants and insects that rely on them. What's the effect of earthworms on trees in the Borealis forest? Any other noted defense mechanism by trees against them? So to repeat, it's what's the effect of earthworms on trees in the Boreal forest? Mike or Suzanne, I'll give it over to either one of you.
Should I take this, Mike?
Yes, please.
Yeah, earthworms are not native to the boreal forest. It's true, or the subboreal, or even most of the temperate forest. And so they're invasive. And what the effect is that earthworms burrow deep down into the soil, and they churn the soil, they mix the soil. So they burrow down, then they come back up and they burrow down. And as they do that, they move nutrients around, especially phosphorus. So they sort of bring phosphorus from the parent material up to the surface horizons. And they just increase mineralization of long stored carbon and nutrients that are locked into the forest floor and into the upper soil horizons. And so on the one hand, it's increased fertility, for understory growth, or maybe even some tree growth. But our forests have not adapted to these, they have not evolved with these earthworms. And so they're actually, they are having an effect on unbalancing the forest, or throwing it out of balance. And so, it's better not to have them, because they are, they will be causing more carbon to be mineralized and evolved into the atmosphere. So it's an unfortunate thing of globalization. Again, globalization can have its good things, and that we can, transmit information. But one of the bad things is that we bring in these creatures from other parts of the world, and then they can be invasive.
Great. As someone else writes, I spent a lot of time in Jasper. The destruction from the pine beetle there is heartbreaking. My question is all of Jasper and Banff National Parks in the Boreal Forest? Mike, would you like to answer that one?
So that's an interesting question. I have to look at the map, but I would say yes. Okay, as you move into British Columbia, you get to the more Cordilleran forests, and some people include that as part of the boreal. But we're talking about the mountain pine beetle infecting the pine stands, and lodgepole pine there it's common in the boreal. So I would call it boreal, but it's a gorgeous forest until it was attacked by the mountain pine beetle. And the trees do have a strategy. They produce more sap to try and protect themselves, but when they get overwhelmed, the result is instead of a vast forest of green, you get a vast forest of red needles, and eventually they fall off. And it's very flammable during the red stage because they're dead needles, and so it can be quite explosive crown fires. The fire spreads from the surface up to the crown to the tree, and high intensity fire.
Mm-hmm. And this question is also for you again, Mike. What is the main cause of fires in the boreal forest? Are they simply destructive, or are they sometimes necessary?
So our boreal forest, our trees and species survive and thrive in this regime of semi-regular, stand renewing, stand replacing, high intensity fire. So they're used to it. It's Mother Nature at work. So it's not bad, it's not good. And sometimes becomes Smokey Bear, we think fires are bad and we have to put them out. And that's the way our fire management used to be. Parks Canada was a bit of exception. The national parks like Jasper and Banff were exceptions, but now many of the provinces and the landowners responsible for fire management. So in Ontario, it's the Ontario Ministry for Natural Forests and Lands now. They do something called appropriate response. And it's like your emergency room at your local hospital. When a fire arrives, they say, is this a threat or not? If it's 2 kilometers from Kirkland Lake, it's a threat. And then you attack it and put it out. But if it's not close to community, they look at the fire weather, they do a fire growth model and say, is it going to be beneficial or detrimental? Mm-hmm. And many times it's beneficial because it kills those bugs and disease or old stands and renews the forest. So they allow the fire and they monitor it. And then the next day they look at it again. They call that appropriate response. We're seeing more and more of that to allow fire on the landscape when and where possible. So we are moving forward. We're learning. And where possible, we do allow fire on the landscape because it's Mother Nature doing her thing.
Kevin, can you talk a little bit about the use of sound in your film?
Sure. Most of the sound in the film was created. Most of the time we were shooting silent in the film when we were in the forest for various practical reasons. So a lot of it was created sound that we, recordings that were taken in the field just by a sound person that were put together by Grant Edmonds and the people at the Dark Studio, who are masters of creating fabulous soundscapes. The one thing that was an interesting location recording is we use bed recordings all through the film that were recorded by the University of Alberta. They have a team that goes out and puts, dozens, maybe hundreds of microphones in the forest, the purpose of which is to record the boreal birds as they come back and forth migrating. By doing this, it's a way for them to monitor what species are in the forest and when and so on. So we were able, and they have a vast collection and they're terrific people to work with. So we were able to ask them for sound specific recordings. So we could say, we're in a wetland, it's morning and it's summer. Can you give us something like that? Or, it's winter and there's hardly anything about, but we know there are grouse about. So all through the film there are these bed tracks that were authentically recorded on with dozens of, maybe more microphones in the Boreal in Alberta, and then a lot of the rest of it was created. And of course, then there's this fabulous music score that was done by Justin Small and Ohad Benchatrip.
Yeah, you also use choir music. What was the reason behind using the choir pieces in the film?
Basically, it was to reinforce the idea that the forest is a community and that the trees are all singing together in a kind of a chorus. And the way that score actually works is Ohad and Justin wrote a different melody for each of the 4 principal trees. So there's the pine, the spruce, the birch, and the poplar. So they wrote a melody for each of those trees, and then they come back and forth when we're focusing on a particular tree. You hear their melody, but then when they come together, we hear the whole chorus. So that was the idea.
Mm. So tree communication brings me back to you, Suzanne. Your next book is called The Mother Tree. What is the mother tree?
Yeah, so mother trees are just the biggest, oldest trees in forests. And so, most of us, when you walk in the forest, a lot of us, including me, our eyes gravitate to those big old trees, the majestic trees with the huge crowns. Those are the mother trees. And so, but it's actually, I came up with this term after a lot of research, and I just wanted to point out that trees actually, our trees have got mothers and fathers in them. And so it's actually kind of a colloquial term. It's not really a scientific term, but it does reflect our science. And the reason so let me explain that a little bit. In that these mycorrhizal networks I talked about, we decided we would map the networks in some forests. So we kind of, peeled back the forest floor, took up all of the fungal material, sequenced it for their DNA, and then made this map of which fungus was connecting which trees together. And what popped out of the map is that it is like an internet in that that you have these hubs, and the hubs are the most highly connected trees. And so those are, those big trees with big root systems. And so they have lots of roots that can connect with fungi that connect with other trees. And so they're the most highly connected trees. And then we started doing a bunch of experiments with these big old trees and planting seedlings around them where they could be connected to the old trees and not, and found that being connected to the old trees was really essential for survival of the seedlings and their growth. We also went further to find that these old trees could recognize which seedlings growing around them were their kin. So whether they could recognize which ones were their own offspring, and they recognize them through the mycorrhizal network. So there's a communication going on between the kin and the kin seedlings and these old trees. And so that's where the term, it's this nurturing idea in the forest, even though there are mothers and fathers in single trees. But I use that term to evoke in people an emotion about that the forest is like a family or a society where there are, nurturing cooperative individuals like mothers and fathers, but mothers really we all have feelings of our mothers. Some maybe we don't like our mothers, but most of it, I think, of us feel this belonging sense. And so that's where that term came from. And yes, my book is it's called Finding the Mother Tree. It comes out on May the 4th. And it's really a memoir about my discoveries and how, how I made them, why I made them, how my background led me to ask the questions that I did.
Kevin, another comment for you. Love the film, both poetic and informative. Can you talk about how you developed the script and match the narration with the images?
Sure. Well, it took me 10 years to get this film made. And anybody that knows anything about filmmaking will know that 8.5 of them were trying to raise the money. But I had plenty of time to read, and I must say, the work that Mike does and the work that Suzanne does were profoundly influenced me and the work. I read their papers and learned about their work, and so I had a lot of time to research, and so I was able to understand the story of the film in a way that's unusual for a documentary because the forest is static. So I knew that the story of the film really takes place over a couple of centuries, and the whole goal of the film would be to try and find a way to represent that. So it was one of these films where we were able to storyboard the film and really plan it quite carefully. But then the challenge became to go into the forest and find the places that would represent. So we had to find a place where there was a fire last year, and then we had to find a place where there was a fire 20 years ago, and then we had to find a place where there was a fire 50 years ago. So, anyway, that was the process of making the film. And along the way, I had a number of wonderful guides that brought us into the forest, showed us things, and I did a number of interviews with people to explain the processes. And then that's the process of editing. You go through all those transcripts, all those, someone like Mike Flannigan gives you an hour, and you end up taking a minute of what he had to say and carefully piecing it in there. So that's the way we make films.
Mm-hmm. So this question is for Mike and Suzanne. Should we be concerned about logging in the boreal forest? And a follow-up question to that, who's logging and how much is being logged? Mike, do you want to start with that one?
Sure. Who's logging? Forest industry. How much? I don't have the number off the top of my head. It's a significant amount, and it's not all in the boreal, but in the forests of Canada. And by and large, the forest industry has changed over the years, and they do replant, or if there's natural seeding available. So it's sustainable, and it's much greener than what it used to be or what people think it is. I mean, there's still some concerns about use of chemicals and things like that. And it doesn't really mimic fire or other disturbances, but it is a significant economic renewable activity. And, I'm okay with it. Okay, so, but everyone has to form their own opinion, do their own research. Suzanne, do you have some thoughts on this?
Yeah, I do. I think that it's everything that Mike has said is true, that I think we harvest about 1% per year on average over our forests. And the assumptions that go behind that harvest rate are that that forests, or we manage our forest on a century-long we call it a rotation, and that every 100 years the idea is to go back and harvest those forests. And so when Mike says it's sustainable, he means that we will have forests there in perpetuity. It's called long run sustained yield in forestry parlance. And we do replant or reforest. There are some issues, though, in that when you combine harvesting with wildfire disturbance rates, oil and gas development, that when you combine all those disturbances together, that Canada is actually disturbing at a much higher rate than 1%. The cumulative effects is much higher. It's in fact, there was a study done by Global Forest Watch about 10 years ago, and they found that Canada was disturbing at a rate of 14%, which is really, really high when we took into account the mega fires, oil and gas, and so on. And to me, that's not sustainable. And where do we how do we correct for that? That's a really hard decision that we have to make, that we have to find a balance where we're not disturbing the forest at such a high rate. And it's going to be challenging because as climate changes, the disturbance rates are going up, right? The rate of fire is going up, they're more frequent, they're more severe. And we in some ways not as predictable as in the past. And so, a conservative way to approach this would be to hold back, right? Like, don't always push the forest to the edge of sustainability, which is basically what we're doing. And so I think that we should be taking a hard look, constantly monitoring what we're doing. Is this really sustainable? And one of the, there's two consequences, there's many consequences, but, two of them that are globally recognized are with harvesting forests, is that it has an impact on biodiversity, no doubt. And it also has an impact on our carbon stocks. And so I've been studying carbon dynamics in forests for a long time. And what we're finding is that when you clear cut a forest, you almost immediately lose about 75% of the carbon from the site, between 60 and 75%, depending. And so we need to take that into account. And there's ways, though, to mitigate that. And one of the ways is to leave patches of old trees. And Mike I'm sure has studied that, even in natural fires, that there are skips and jumps and live trees, big tracts of live trees left behind. And we can mimic that. It's called emulating natural disturbance. And I think that, we should be trying to do that. I'm sure that they're doing it in the boreal forest. They're doing it here as well in the temperate forest, but we could do a much better job at that. And what we're finding is that as we leave more and more of these old trees, and I'll call them mother trees, we sort of dampen down the loss of carbon from those sites and the loss of biodiversity. So leaving islands of trees, tracts of trees, even when we're harvesting, is super important to mitigate those losses.
Kevin, I have a tech-related question for you. Could you please talk briefly about the camera and microphone equipment you used for filming?
No. Well, the camera, I think the camera was an FS7, I think. It was a Sony camera, I believe. I had three fantastic cinematographers on this project. John Min Tran, who I work with all the time, Joshua C. and Hugo Kitching, who are fantastic wildlife cinematographers. And so I don't actually know a whole lot about the equipment because my strategy is to hire people that know a whole lot more than I do and let them do what they think best.
Great. Dr. Simard and Dr. Flannigan, here's a question for you from an audience member, and really excuse my pronunciation of this very scientific term. Please discuss mycorrhizal networks and the cooperative symbiotic nature of those mutually beneficial forest relationships. Mycorrhizae.
Mycorrhizal.
Thank you. And give me hope for our future. Could you tell us what it is in the first place and then answer the question? Suzanne, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, so like I mentioned at the beginning, the mycorrhizas, the word mycorrhiza is about a relationship, and it's the relationship between the trees and the fungus. And it's a mutualistic, generally a mutualistic relationship where both the fungus and the tree are helping each other out. The fungus traveling through the soil and bringing back nutrients and water for the tree in trade for photosynthate. And these are super significant in that, for one, like I said, that they're really facilitate recovery of the forest. So all the seedlings that come in, the seed, within 3 months, those seedlings become mycorrhizal. They have to be, otherwise they don't survive. And they tap into the networks of the old trees. So the old trees are fixing lots of carbon, they're supporting this network, the seeds come down, or the cones open up in the case of the pines, and the seedlings germinate, and their roots, or their little tiny roots, tap into the networks that are supported by these old trees. And the old trees will then subsidize them with carbon and nutrients until the little seedlings are able to make enough leaves of their own that they can have a positive carbon balance. So they're absolutely crucial to the regeneration of the forest. They're also crucial to carbon storage in the soil. And so the fungal network itself, it accounts for about 20% of the carbon that's in the soil. And so it's really a conduit, I would say, or a pipeline from the photosynthetic machinery in the crown into the soil. And they take up about 20% of the carbon of the tree's requirements, and then they store it in the soil in these really secure and safe compounds. And it's a lot.
Right. And I have a question for you, Mike, related to fires. 2 questions about recent fires. Number one, could you provide your view on increases of extreme forest fire events in Canadian Rockies boreal forests and possible adaptation of the boreal ecosystem? Do you want to start with that one, and I'll read the second one after?
So we are seeing more fire, especially in Western and Northern Canada, which would include British Columbia. And the seasons seem to be getting hotter. Okay, we're getting warmer all across Canada. Reports are out, Canada's warming at twice the rate of the rest of the globe. Northern areas at 3 times the rate. So it's getting warmer, and warmer conditions means longer fire seasons, more lightning, drier fuels. So this is a signal of what's to come. And, don't get me wrong, not every year is going to be a bad fire year, but we're going to see more bad fire years. And, if continues to see more and more fire in the landscape, eventually the trees are unable to regenerate. Even if you use, suckering like aspen does, if you're hit repeatedly with fires, nothing will survive in terms of trees. And then we start talking about shrubs and grass, and they can burn all the time. So, some of us have written a paper, and we're moving towards the grass world as fire increases, not just in Canada, but around the world. And unless we do something. So that's how soon? That's a good question. It could be decades or centuries, but we're on that path.
Great. And the second question is, since 2020 was a quieter than average fire year, in part to isolation from COVID, will we see a larger fire season this year because there wasn't as much burning last summer?
So there's a lot of year-to-year variability. And like I mentioned, not every year is going to be a bad fire year. Some years are going to be colder and wetter, but on average, we're going to see more fire. As to this year, and yes, COVID probably did play a role in parts of Canada because people weren't out in the woods. Some of the industry was shut down as well. So there weren't as many fires last year, but it was also cooler and wetter in many parts of Canada. This year, who knows? It depends on day-to-day weather. But I will tell you that somewhere it will be a bad fire season. You know, last year it was California and Siberia, and before that Australia and the Amazon. Who knows where it's going to be this year? But it could be Canada. And, you know, I expect to see Eastern Canada, especially in the coming decades, to start to see more and more fire, where we're getting to a point where I think fire is going to increase all across Canada, not just the West and just the North.
So I have a question here for Mike and Suzanne. What should I know about with regards to balancing recreational use and preserving the boreal forest ecosystem? Suzanne, did you want to answer that one? How do you balance the two?
That's a great question. You know, I mean, people are part of the earth, and we have influences on the forest globally. Obviously, through climate change, there's a global influence, but even locally in our use of forests, logging or recreating or whatever we do, cultivating trees. So, you know, the presence of people in the landscape has always been there. I think, you know, that in my own thinking of it, this has evolved over time. I used to just not want people in the forest, so I could just have this pristine forest to myself, or, you know, these conserved or preserved forests, but it's just not realistic. It's not the way forests have evolved. And so I think that, you know, that we do and have always coexisted with forests, and we'll continue to do. And I think that, you know, we need to always check on how we're respecting the forest. And, you know, I think that there's been changes over the last couple of 100 years, and in that as our population has grown, our consumption has grown, that our exploitation of forests has grown alongside that. And it's not always careful and responsible. And I think that, you know, given that we are we are one with the forest, we are one with nature, and we always are going to be, that to check on our role and our respect, and to always take a step back and say, is this the most respectful thing I can do? And as far as recreation goes, I mean, I think the more people that get out and understand and love the forest, the more we're going to conserve them, which seems counterintuitive in that there'll be more people out there. But I think that it's absolutely essential that we all remain connected and care for it. Therefore, when we understand it and care, we can add pressures to certain parts, like our politicians, for example, to our parks, to our logging industry, to work with us to make sure that we maintain that balance, and so that we can continue to enjoy our forests. So there's definitely always people will want to recreate and be there, and it's good for us, and it's actually good for the forest in a lot of ways too.
Mike, did you want to add any advice to that?
That was a great answer. From a very fire-centric point of view, we have lots to learn from Indigenous peoples who learned to live with fire for thousands of years. And we have to learn to live with fire. And thus far, we haven't done a great job. So there's room for improvement. So yes, lots to learn from Indigenous fire keepers.
And I have another question from Mike and Suzanne. Should herbicides intended for killing off deciduous trees be banned entirely from forest operations in the boreal forest?
I can take that, Mike, if you want.
Go right ahead.
Okay. I've studied this quite a bit in my earlier part of my career, because in southern British Columbia there was a lot of spraying of birches and aspens and poplars, and you know there was a lot of public pressure not to do that, and essentially it's become very localized. However, in the northern part of British Columbia, including our part, the northeastern part of British Columbia is in the boreal forest. And across the boreal in Canada, there is still a lot of herbicide spraying. I think we don't need it, to be honest. My studies, and I studied this for decades, is that when we spray these aspens and birches, that we're actually taking out an essential part of the ecosystem, that they are there for they're part of succession. They heal disturbances. They capture carbon very quickly compared to coniferous trees. They have their roles, and to think, it's kind of arrogant to think that we should go in there and kill these trees to favor those conifers that we think are going to make a lot more money. Spraying chemicals in the environment, I just don't think it's, for that purpose is a good idea. I think that, and I've studied this a lot too, that there are other ways of managing forests that we won't need to use these chemicals if we harvest at the right time in the right configurations, we prepare the ground, time the harvest with the seed fall, and if we're going to plant right away with the right stock that's locally adapted, that we can avoid having to use these chemicals. It just means understanding your forest really well, knowing the land. And Mike mentioned Indigenous knowledge keepers. That's how they got to know their forest, is knowing the land. And I think that that we have a lot to learn from that in knowing our forests, and we don't have to use then these draconian kind of, I think they're very, old archaic methods that we don't need to do it.
I'm going to try to get in a few more questions. We have another one. Can you talk about urban trees? This is for Mike or Suzanne. When I heard about mycorrhizaes networks, I wondered about trees that are isolated on front yards. Are they orphan trees?
That's a really great question. Not necessarily, so the roots of a tree, if you want to sort of think of how big roots go out of a tree, we've studied, in our Douglas fir forest down here where we have a 20-meter tall tree, the roots go out 20 meters. So they're about as widespread as they are tall. And then the mycorrhizal networks go out even further. So they'll connect tree to tree to tree to tree until the whole forest is connected together, even though the roots are localized, around the height of the tree. And so if you think of that extent of that below ground network, if you've got one tree in your yard and your neighbor has got a tree in their yard, or even across the street, those roots and mycorrhizas will find each other and they will connect together. But if you can, there's certain things you can do to enhance that network, and that is to have a community of trees, not just an isolated tree, because they are social creatures just like us. And plant them in good soil to foster their mycorrhizas. Composting is really good for that. And also having a diversity of trees and a diversity of fungi, that creates a nice resilient urban forest that is highly connected below ground.
So here's a question from Mike. Are there plantation efforts from industry that are not only monocultures?
Absolutely. So planting just one species, it's still done, but that's forestry of the past. Now you plant the best species for that site, and there's lowlands, uplands, and wetlands, and you have to know what species does best, and using local seed stock if you're planting. So yes, things have progressed from those days. I mean, there's still some areas where you do get monocultures, the same tree species planted row after row after row, but it's becoming a thing of the past.
And here's a question for all three of you. Is the boreal forest protected by the provincial and federal government? What legislation exists to protect it? I don't know who would like to answer that, but Suzanne or Mike or Kevin, do you know the answer to this question?
Well, I can start a little bit. So the forests are actually managed by the provinces. It's a provincial jurisdiction. So, the rate of cut in a forest is set by the province. All the regulations around harvesting and planting and caring for the forest is set by the province. Federally, the role of the federal government is to govern more national issues like global change, for example. What is our carbon balance nationally, even though provincially we also have those concerns, or species at risk legislation is at the national level. And certain, of course, protected areas, parks, they happen at both the federal and the provincial level. But the actual management of forests and conservation of those forests is done at the provincial level. There might be some, specific issues or federal issues in the boreal forest that protect them that I'm not aware of, that maybe Kevin or Mike are aware of.
I'll just add to that things like caribou, and so that's a species at risk, is covered by federal policy. But otherwise, it's the responsibility of the landowner, which in Canada is provinces, territories, Parks Canada, and D&D to some extent.
So I have a question for Suzanne. Dr. Simard, your work is in many respects revolutionary. In forestry, we were always told about competition, not cooperation. What are the implications of your work regarding co-evolution theory?
That's a great question. So in its, I could go on for a long time, but I won't. But just to say that, competition has been sort of a guiding principle in forest management, as it has in agriculture for a couple hundred years. And we've thought of trees as individuals until this work that I've been doing, and others have been doing it too, but that that we need to manage this competition so that we can grow forests that look like we want them to look like. And really, it's like having one eye shut, right? It's because there's a myriad of ways that trees and plants and organisms interact. There's a whole host of ways they interact. It's not simply one way, which, competition. There's also collaboration, there's parasitisms, there's pathogens, there's all kinds of ways that organisms relate to one another. And when we take into account that full suite of relationships, then we can more fully understand, how trees and plants grow and grow together. But that idea of competition really came out of Darwinian views, but also other, there's other thinkers at the time. And I don't think that Darwin really intended us to become so, singularly focused on competition, because he understood the role of cooperation in coevolution as well, and evolution. And I think he would be horrified to think that I don't know if he would be horrified, but I'm horrified to think that, we've taken this concept and just applied it carte blanche across so many of our practices, and it's led us astray in so many ways. But most evolution, including our own evolution, has been a coevolutionary process. Like a tree is a microbiome, we're microbiomes. We, endosymbiosis, which was sort of theoretically developed out of Lynn Margulis's lab, where she said evolution is really a product. It really is a product of mutualisms and cooperation, more so than competition. I think once we get back to realizing that, and we've moved very quickly. Even with the Human Genome Project, we've realized that a lot of our DNA originates from viruses and bacteria and archaea and so on. That once we can get over that, in ecology, which we haven't quite yet, we still are managing competition. If we can just get past that and realize it's a much more complex and sophisticated suite of interactions, then we'll do a lot better with how we deal or manage our forests. And I could say a lot more, but I won't.
Unfortunately, we're almost out of time, but I did want to ask one last question that all three of you could speak to. And that's, what does the future hold for the Canadian boreal forest? So we could really briefly get an answer from each of you. Kevin, why don't I start with you?
I think that is up to us. I think the future of the forest, like the future of every other ecosystem on this planet and in this country, has been put into our hands by our actions. We've become such a, we by no means dominate the world, or dominate, we by no means can control these systems, but we certainly can dominate them in certainly right at the moment in negative ways. So I think the answer to the question is the future of that forest is up to us, and it's about how much we understand it and how much. I was really struck by what Suzanne said about respecting it. We don't respect other creatures to the degree that they need to be respected for their health and for our health. So I think we will see what the future is.
Great. Mike, what do you think is the future of the boreal forest?
Well, the boreal forest is a treasure, and instead of a maple leaf, we should have a black spruce on our flag, because that's pandemic, or it's across Canada, much more so than our maples. Future, challenging, okay? And with climate change and land use activities, but it is challenging, but there's opportunities, and it's up to us to make sure that we save our forest, because it's in danger of disappearing, at least parts of it, in the short term, due to disturbances, drought, insects, disease, and most notably climate change. So we have a chore ahead of us, but we can do it.
Great. And Suzanne?
Yeah, I completely agree with Kevin and Mike. Those are great answers. It is up to us, and it is at a tipping point. You know, all of our forests around the world are at a tipping point. And you know, the number one thing we can do is reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. We have to do this. We have to decarbonize our energy system. If we don't, then it's going to be a pretty suffering future for the boreal as well as the human population and all the populations of species on the earth. And land use change, Mike mentioned that too, like that goes hand in hand with reducing fossil fuel consumption. We also need to be very cognizant of how we're changing the forest and using it. And we need to become more of a respectful, productive society rather than a disrespectful, exploitive society. And I think Mike also mentioned about the Indigenous people have always had this view of living with the forest as one with the forest. We have much to learn from them. And so those are three things. And I'll say one last thing is that just like in a forest, our human societies are systems, right? We're complex systems. And complex systems have certain features. And one of those features is tipping points. And those tipping points can be catastrophic, but they can also be very positive. We can go, we can go down like this, or we can go up like this. So once we make changes, like for example, if we can decarbonize and, get off fossil fuels within the next decade or two, then, we can elicit or promote a lot of positive change, and it will start, right? Just moving to electric cars is it's got some problems too, but those kinds of policy changes are crucial. And then we can get on this positive trajectory of positive change that is very hopeful. It doesn't have to be a negative, fearful future. It can be very positive. We just have to make the right decisions.
So those are some very wise and inspiring words to end on. I want to thank the panelists for their very interesting and generous answers to all the questions today. I also want to thank the National Film Board of Canada and also Hot Docs at Home for organizing this event. And I want to remind you that if you haven't had a chance to see the film, you can still do so by going to nfb.ca. And if you'd like to see it in French, go to onf.ca. And if you'd like to organize a community screening of the film, you can do so by emailing the National Film Board at communityscreenings@nfb.ca. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aisha. Thank you, Mike. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.